Early one quiet morning in late June, Walt Duncan gently raised his American flag on a wooden pole he'd owned since 1982. The rising sun cast long shadows over the tidy lawns of Bridle Creek, a suburban neighborhood where porches still bore hanging flower baskets and wind chimes clinked lazily in the breeze. Walt moved slowly, deliberately, the kind of motion that belonged to a man who had lived long enough to savor silence. He adjusted the flag rope with fingers that had once gripped a rifle, his gaze lifted to the cloth as it caught the morning light. The stars and stripes fluttered softly, and for a moment, Walt stood motionless, chin slightly raised. It was as if the past were watching him, not haunting, just observing, approving. Bridle Creek was a place of order. Lawns trimmed, mailboxes matching, holiday decorations timed to perfection. The Homeowners Association, known locally as the Board, enforced those norms with rigorous precision. And at the helm of the board was Marla Jefferson. Marla's SUV crept around the bend just as Walt was securing the base of the pole into the soil near his porch railing. She drove slowly, purposefully, the way one might patrol a property line. Her tinted window lowered a crack, just enough for her eyes to narrow. Walt, bent slightly with age but unbothered, waved politely. Marla didn't wave back. She pulled a pen from behind her ear and scribbled something on the clipboard she kept in her passenger seat. Then she drove off. Later that day, Walt returned from trimming his roses out front, clippers in hand, his straw hat slightly askew, to find a folded sheet of paper in his mailbox. Not the post office's doing, no stamp, just an envelope marked HOA, Notice of Violation. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he brought it inside, washed his hands, and waited for Claire. Claire arrived just before noon, iced tea in hand and laptop bag over her shoulder. She had her mother's eyes and her father's calm demeanor, except when it came to the HOA. "What now?" she muttered, flipping open the envelope as Walt handed it to her. "Improper display of unauthorized external decor, Section 4B HOA standards." She laughed once, sharp and short. "It's a flag, Dad." Walt smiled faintly. "So it is. You didn't even hang it for the 4th yet." "Just testing the pulley. It's new. The old one frayed last year." She dropped into the porch rocker. "Marla's the type who irons her bedsheets. She'll make a fuss over anything not beige." That evening, just as the sky was bruising with dusk, Officer Jim Halley pulled up in his cruiser. He didn't knock. Just leaned against the wooden fence and called out, "Walt?" Walt came down the steps, wiping his hands on a rag. "Evenin', Jim." Jim grinned. "Got a call. Something about a potential code violation." "For the flag?" "That's the one." He paused. "No state or federal law broken. HOA can't override the Constitution, not that they haven't tried." Walt nodded. "Didn't figure you for making arrests over fabric." Jim chuckled. "Not unless someone strangles a neighbor with it." They talked a while longer, about old cars, the Phillies' losing streak, the price of eggs. Then Jim got back in his cruiser and tipped his hat as he pulled away. Inside, the house was quiet. Walt sat at his small kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped Veterans of Foreign Wars mug. The answering machine blinked. He pressed play. Marla's voice crackled through, "Mr. Duncan. This is your final warning. Please remove the flag or I will escalate this matter through the HOA's enforcement procedures. We expect compliance by end of week." He let the message finish, then deleted it without comment. Walking slowly to his bedroom, Walt opened a drawer in the oak dresser he'd built with his father nearly 70 years ago. Dust coated the brass handle. He reached inside and pulled out a velvet-lined box. Inside lay his military commendation, dulled with time, but still solid. Holding it in one hand, he stared at the flag outside his window. The cloth swayed gently in the breeze, resolute. "I've stood taller for less." Walt rereads the HOA guidelines with a magnifying glass, highlighting the part about no permanent flag fixtures. The light from his desk lamp glinted off the lens, casting a yellowish glow over the crinkled paper as he squinted, lips pursed. The rulebook, now dog-eared and slightly curled at the edges, sat among gardening catalogs and a chipped army mug holding 3 stubby pencils. Dust motes floated lazily through the morning light slanting into his converted garage office. He ran a finger beneath the sentence for the 3rd time. "Permanent fixtures are prohibited," he murmured. "Temporary patriotic displays may be allowed during federally designated holiday weeks." The door creaked open behind him. "Morning, Dad," Claire said, balancing 2 cups of coffee, one without a lid, his. "You're already deep into battle strategy?" Walt grunted softly. "I read slow when I'm angry." She set the coffees down and perched on a stool beside his workbench. Her eyes flicked over the mess: a half-built birdhouse, coiled extension cords, gardening gloves that hadn't been washed in years. "You know you don't have to fight this," she said after a sip. "But you always were the quiet, stubborn type." Walt adjusted a framed photo of his late wife on the shelf above his desk. Her smile, frozen in time from a church picnic in '89, looked out at them both. "I don't like being told what I already know," he said. "Especially by someone who didn't ask first." Claire chuckled, then turned her attention to the page he'd marked. Rule 14.2b. "You've got a loophole." "Not a loophole," Walt said, tapping the phrase with his pencil. "A pathway." Together, they crafted a letter to the HOA, citing Rule 14.2b and his intent to display the flag temporarily in honor of Independence Day. Walt dictated while Claire typed, the old inkjet printer wheezing like it had been pulled from a museum. "It's still Patriotic Week if I start early," he said. The Founding Fathers didn't wait for a calendar. Once printed, the letter was carefully folded, sealed in a plain envelope, and marked to the HOA board. Walt pulled on his canvas jacket despite the summer warmth, and walked it down the block to the little brown HOA mailbox near the community garden. He took the long way back, nodding at neighbors, greeting the collier's cat who always sunbathed on the sidewalk. Back in his yard, Walt clipped the edges of the hedges and adjusted the bird feeder, then noticed Mrs. Nguyen from next door approaching with a foil-wrapped loaf. "I baked too much," she said shyly, offering him the lemon bread with a smile. He took it with both hands. "My wife used to make something like this. Always forgot the sugar." Mrs. Nguyen laughed softly, then looked toward the flag. "I saw someone taking pictures earlier." Walt nodded. "That's become the norm." She didn't press further. "I hope it all resolves. You've always kept your yard the nicest on the block." "That's the plan," he said. Later that afternoon, Marla arrived. No warning. Just 3 brisk knocks on the door and the sound of heels on cement. Walt opened it to find her holding a clipboard in one hand and a plastic protractor in the other. "Good afternoon, Mr. Duncan," she said, voice flat. "Just a brief check on the angle and placement of the flag mount." "You could have called," he said. "Documentation must be precise," she replied. "I'm simply fulfilling my duty." He stepped aside as she approached the pole, eyes focused like a surveyor plotting contested land. She knelt slightly, measuring the tilt and base depth, scribbling notes. "You sure you won't come inside for a glass of water?" he asked. "No, thank you," she replied crisply, rising to her feet. "This isn't personal." Walt looked at her, jaw steady, eyes firm. "It is now." Marla blinked, said nothing, then walked away, heels clicking with finality down the walkway. That evening, just as the street lamps buzzed on and the last of the daylight slipped behind the trees, Claire looked out from the living room window. Her breath caught. "Dad," she whispered, motioning him over. Across the street, a silver sedan idled, headlights off. Inside, Marla held a smartphone, camera pointed squarely at Walt's porch. She didn't move, didn't wave, just sat there, recording. A video titled "Old Man Defies HOA Over Flag" quietly goes up on the neighborhood Facebook page. No fanfare. Just a blurry thumbnail of Walt Duncan's front yard, the stars and stripes fluttering in the background, and Marla Jefferson's voice faintly audible behind the lens. The title alone does the heavy lifting, hinting at rebellion in a community not known for drama. Walt didn't see it go up. He didn't have a Facebook account, never saw the need. People used to talk face to face, he once told Claire. If you wanted gossip, you went to church. But Claire saw it. She tapped her phone over breakfast on Walt's porch, the tin watering can resting at her feet. Marla posted a video, she said without looking up. Or someone gave it to her. You're the old man. She paused, scrolling. It's racking up views. Walt didn't flinch. He was plucking dry leaves from his rose bush, the small pruning shears clicking softly in his hand. She called you non-compliant. Said you were setting a dangerous precedent for the neighborhood. Whatever that means. Claire frowned. But here's the thing, there are comments. Still no response. Mrs. Santiago said, that old man stood up for my boy years ago. Still standing. Walt looked up from his gardening, just for a moment. Carlos Santiago? Yeah. Walt nodded. 5th grade. Got blamed for carving initials in a desk he didn't touch. Claire grinned. And let me guess, you vouched for him. Because I watched him. I was the substitute that week. He went back to pruning, deliberate and unbothered. Around the neighborhood, things began to shift. Slightly. Quietly. Mrs. Nguyen taped a miniature flag, no more than 6 inches wide, to her own mailbox. She didn't mention it when she brought over leftover dumplings that afternoon. Just smiled and asked if Walt needed more potting soil. Walt declined politely and offered her a small tin of Earl Grey tea in return. At the Bridal Beans Cafe, where retirees played dominoes and the waitresses never wrote down orders, Walt walked in like he always did, slow, upright, soft-footed. 2 men at the corner table looked up. Neither smiled, but both raised their mugs toward him. Just a silent toast. Walt nodded in reply and took his usual seat by the window. Back online, the video kept gaining traction. Most comments were quiet praises or emojis, thumbs up, flags, prayers. A few were skeptical. One person asked, "Isn't it against HOA policy?" But even that was met with a string of responses citing the rule Walt had included in his letter. Marla didn't reply to any of the comments. But she read them. All of them. The next evening, the sky streaked orange and lavender as Claire stepped onto the porch with a glass of sweet tea. Walt was sitting in his rocker, polishing the wooden armrest with an old cloth. "She's coming," Claire said quietly. "I saw her walking down the street with that same clipboard." Walt didn't move. 3 knocks. Sharp. Then the squeak of Marla's flats on the wooden porch. "Mr. Duncan," she said, voice tight. "This is your final notification. You have 24 hours before we begin formal procedures through the HOA's legal counsel. You'll be responsible for all associated costs." Walt looked at her but didn't speak. She waited for a beat, then turned briskly and walked away. As the sound of her heels faded, Claire leaned over and said just above a whisper, "She doesn't know what you've already faced." The HOA emergency meeting fills faster than expected, and not just with the usual folks. The folding chairs squeak under the weight of unfamiliar neighbors, some clutching reusable water bottles, others with arms crossed, curious. A teenager in a hoodie stood near the door. 2 veterans from the VFW hall leaned against the wall, quiet as gravestones. The clubhouse smelled faintly of paper towels and burnt coffee. A fluorescent light flickered overhead, buzzing with a tired hum. Walt stood near the back, close to the coffee urn, wearing a navy sport coat and, for the first time in years, the small bronze service pin he'd once said was just collecting dust. He hadn't planned to speak. He was simply there. Claire sat beside him, notepad in hand. She glanced at the turnout, then leaned in. "You don't have to say much, Dad. Just stand there. That's loud enough." Marla clicked to the front of the room in a pair of beige kitten heels, the clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. "Good evening," she began, clearing her throat more than once. "We're here tonight because of a concern involving adherence to long-standing HOA rules. This meeting is not about any one individual but about maintaining the integrity and uniformity of Bridal Creek. The room remained still, polite, though a few heads tilted toward Walt. She went on, citing bylaws, referencing Clause 5.1c and 14.2b. She even gestured toward a small projection of the guidelines on a crooked pull-down screen. Claire raised her hand. Marla gave a tight nod. "I'm speaking on behalf of my father," Claire said calmly. He submitted a written response, quoting Rule 14.2b, which allows temporary patriotic displays during federal holidays. The flag went up on June 28, which is within the week of Independence Day, per federal observance. A few quiet nods rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Santiago leaned slightly forward. Mrs. Nguyen sat with hands clasped in her lap, eyes steady. Marla didn't hide her irritation. "This is not a popularity contest," she snapped. "And this community is not governed by social media sentiment." Claire replied, "No. It's governed by rules. Which we're following." The pause stretched. Walt stepped forward. "No microphone. No podium. I've followed rules my whole life," he said, voice low but clear. "I'm not breaking one now." Silence swallowed the room. No rustling, no throat clears. Then, slow, deliberate applause. It started from the back, someone near the snack table. Then two more. A ripple. Not thunderous, but grounded. Neighbors clapped with hands pressed just enough to be heard. Even Deputy Hallie, standing off to the side, gave a subtle nod. Marla's lips pinched. She shuffled her notes, looked toward the rest of the board. They whispered briefly, unsure. "Given the circumstances," she finally announced, her voice thinner now, "the HOA will postpone any formal action until after July 4th. This will allow for community review." She didn't meet Walt's eyes. The chairs scraped as people stood. Some walked up to shake Walt's hand, just quick grasps, murmurs of "thank you" or "about time." Walt said little, as always. Claire collected her notes with a small smile, then whispered, that was louder than a speech. July 4th arrives, and Bridal Creek looks like it walked out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Children with stars painted on their cheeks darted between lawn chairs and picnic tables. The town green buzzed with laughter and sizzling grills. Walt Duncan adjusted the brim of his old army cap as he walked beside Claire, who was carrying a container of deviled eggs wrapped in foil. He paused near the gazebo, watching as neighbors arranged folding chairs and red, white, and blue streamers fluttered from the rafters. Claire leaned toward him. "They asked if you'd lead the pledge," she said, almost sheepishly. "Just a quick one, right before the music starts." Walt raised an eyebrow but didn't say no. Marla Jefferson stood near the gazebo, clipboard in hand, her gaze scanning the crowd like a drill sergeant overseeing a chaotic battalion. She stepped toward the stage, fiddling with the sound system, a tight frown creasing her face. Behind her, one of the teens tapped on a speaker, then shrugged helplessly. The microphone squealed, then went silent. Marla, pacing near the gazebo, muttered, "This isn't about flags anymore." Claire caught the words, exchanged a glance with Walt, who offered no reaction. Down by the picnic tables, someone handed Walt a paper plate piled high with potato salad and baked beans. He balanced it on his palm as he made his way to a bench under a maple tree. Several older neighbors nodded at him as he passed. No one said much, but there was a quiet gravity in their small gestures, a bottle of root beer handed over, a seat saved with a folded blanket. After a while, a child, maybe 6 or 7, approached with a tiny flag in hand, the edges slightly frayed. He looked up at Walt with wide eyes. "Will you hold this?" the boy asked. Walt took the flag and nodded once. As he stood and raised it, a cheer rippled across the crowd. Spontaneous. Genuine. The sort of moment that made time feel slower. Claire, standing off to the side, raised her phone and began to record, not theatrically, but just enough to keep the moment. Marla pushed forward toward the gazebo, clipboard forgotten. She tapped at her phone, then held it high. This event is now being documented, she declared, voice tight. Because it seems some people here don't believe in order. Or the rules we all agreed on. People turned, mildly confused. One dad in a flag-themed t-shirt paused mid-bite of a hot dog. Two elderly women shifted in their folding chairs but didn't move otherwise. Undeterred, Marla kept speaking. You think this is about patriotism, but it's not. It's about who follows the process. About accountability. Her phone was still recording, streaming live to the neighborhood Facebook page. But the lens caught something else, grandparents holding hands. A trio of teenagers helping a toddler get more juice. Veterans in matching pins laughing over old jokes. Claire continued filming from the sidelines, her focus never wavering. Marla's voice rose. They'll see this, all of it. And they'll know I did everything by the book. But the audience, both online and in the park, wasn't reacting the way she hoped. Comments began appearing beneath her livestream. Claire showed her phone to Walt. Why is she yelling at a party? Let the man hold a flag. Looks like she's the only one not enjoying the 4th. Respect to Mr. Duncan. That's the real Bridal Creek. The children resumed playing. The music picked up, someone strumming a gentle guitar version of America the Beautiful. Marla's voice faltered. She lowered her phone. She stood for another beat, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the sidewalk, swallowed by the sound of laughter and chatter. As the sky darkened, people began pulling out blankets and pointing up at the first faint sparkle of fireworks on the horizon. Claire and Walt walked home quietly, passing by homes adorned with paper lanterns and sparklers stuck into flower pots. Inside, the air was cooler. Walt settled into his chair, the small flag still in his hand. Claire sat nearby, her phone buzzing now and then with new notifications. She glanced up and said, softly, they picked a side. You didn't even ask them to. The morning after, Walt reads a handwritten note left in his mailbox. Thank you for reminding us what this place means. He held the note gently, the edges still curled from the early morning dew. The handwriting was in careful script, blue ink slightly faded as if written in the dark, or maybe by someone unsure of their words but firm in their gratitude. Walt tucked it into his breast pocket and turned back to his hedges. The shears made soft snips as he worked his way down the line of boxwoods. A child pedaled by on a red bike with plastic streamers on the handlebars. Morning, Mr. Duncan, the boy called, waving one hand. Walt gave a slight nod and raised his clippers in reply. Claire pulled into the driveway with a small brown paper bag and 2 coffees balanced in a cardboard tray. She waved before she even stepped out. Brought donuts, she said, holding the bag like a peace offering. Figured you'd earned a break. Walt wiped his hands on a faded towel and took one of the coffees. Still warm, he said approvingly. From across the street, Mrs. Nguyen approached with a small Tupperware container wrapped in a tea towel. Lemon cookies, she said, offering them without ceremony. No walnuts this time, I remember. She lingered a moment, watching the flag move softly in the breeze. You didn't fight with noise, she said. You fought with your roots. Walt didn't answer, but his shoulders relaxed just a little. The flag's edge snapped lightly in the wind. Throughout the morning, people came by. Not crowds, just ones and twos, a neighbor dropping off a flower pot with miniature daisies, a young man handing over a handwritten thank you card, a high school girl who said softly, "My granddad would have liked you." Claire sat on the porch steps, scrolling her phone. The HOA board just sent a newsletter, she said, claiming they're reevaluating flag ordinances to better reflect our community values. She looked up. That's bureaucratic we messed up. Walt grunted and sipped his coffee. A little later, Claire unfolded the local newspaper and tapped a column halfway down the front page. Veteran stands tall in Bridal Creek, she read aloud. They interviewed Mrs. Santiago. Called you a local example of grace. As if on cue, Mrs. Santiago herself appeared, holding a plastic-wrapped tray of sugar cookies in shapes of stars. These are for the hero we didn't know we needed, she said, resting them carefully on the porch railing. "And before you say anything," she added, wagging a finger at Walt, "don't return the tray. I've got 5 more." Walt chuckled, the sound low and warm. By mid-afternoon, the sun was high and the porch was still. Claire flipped through a gardening magazine, while Walt quietly swept clippings from the walkway. There was a rhythm to the day, nothing loud, but steady, like the tick of a clock that had always been there. Inside the house, the answering machine blinked once. Claire pressed play. "You are cordially invited to speak at the upcoming HOA policy meeting," the voice said. "Your input is valued as we reconsider current ordinances." She looked at her father. "That's an olive branch," she said. "Could be a stick," Walt replied. "Are you going to go?" Walt didn't answer at first. He picked up the flag from where it leaned against the porch rail and straightened it in its holder. "Not to fight," he said finally. "But maybe to listen. Maybe to let someone else speak for once." They sat quietly, sharing the rest of the coffee and half a donut. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the leaves. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler hissed to life, then clicked through its slow arc. Claire tilted her head. "You ready to help rewrite the rules?" Walt nodded. "Only if they're written in pencil." The HOA meeting room was unusually full, not for complaints this time, but for change. Rows of metal folding chairs lined the community clubhouse, each one occupied by faces usually seen behind garden fences or across cul-de-sacs. The usual musty scent of carpet cleaner had been replaced by the faint aroma of fresh coffee and anticipation. Taped to a few chairs were handwritten signs in marker ink: "Respect our neighbors, community over control, listen first." The midsummer evening sun filtered through the blinds and slanted gold. Walt sat near the front in a pressed collared shirt, his silver flag pin gleaming faintly under the ceiling fluorescence. He hadn't worn this shirt since Claire's college graduation. Tonight, he smoothed the creases carefully before buttoning it. Claire stood just behind him, one hand on the back of his chair. She wore quiet pride in her stance. "You always told me silence can be louder than shouting," she whispered. "Looks like they heard it." Walt didn't answer, but he reached for her hand for a brief moment before letting it go. Marla sat 3 seats away, fingers laced tightly around a manila folder stuffed with forms and printed bylaws. She wore her HOA pin like a badge of endurance, but her lips were pressed into a line that didn't quite hide the fatigue. The board president, a retiree named Greg with kind eyes and a clipboard far older than the job deserved, tapped the mic once. "Let's keep it civil," he said. "We've got new business on the table." Claire stepped forward and unfolded a stack of papers. "This petition," she said evenly, "is signed by over 60% of homeowners in Bridal Creek. We propose rotating term limits for HOA leadership and mandatory quarterly town halls open to all residents." There was a low murmur. A woman in the back nodded slowly. Someone near the window whispered, "About time." Marla stood. "This is a procedural violation," she said sharply. "Petitions must be submitted to the board 2 weeks prior. That's in the charter." Claire glanced at her father. Walt stood. He looked at no one and everyone. "We all want to be heard," he said, his voice steady. "Even you, Marla." That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Marla sat down without replying. Greg sighed and nodded to a table where slips of paper and golf pencils were arranged. "Ballots are ready," he said. "Write your name, your vote. Fold once." One by one, neighbors approached the table. No one spoke above a whisper. A young mother bounced a toddler on her hip as she scribbled on her paper. An older man with a VA cap took his time folding. A middle-aged father wrote something on the back before dropping it in the box. When the last vote was cast, Greg opened the lid and began to tally. Claire leaned in. "I saw someone write a note on theirs," she said softly. Walt nodded but didn't ask what it said. As Greg finished counting, he looked up, almost surprised. "Majority rules," he said. "The proposal passes. Leadership term limits are adopted. Effective immediately." Marla's folder slid slightly from her lap. She caught it with one hand, clutched it tighter. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the silence was full of meaning. One of the neighbors, a lanky man in his 30s, walked over and offered his hand to Walt. "Thanks," he said. "For keeping it decent." Others began speaking quietly among themselves, some introducing their names for the first time. Greg looked relieved, maybe even hopeful, as he nodded toward the sign-up sheet now taped to the wall, "Volunteer Board Opportunities." As she packed her folder, Marla walked past Walt. She didn't make eye contact at first, but then stopped. "You think you've won?" she said. Walt looked up at her, his voice soft. "No. We've remembered." On a breezy morning in mid-July, Walt sits on his porch, sipping coffee from his chipped veteran's mug. The wood beneath him creaked softly with each shift of weight, but it was a familiar sound, like an old friend clearing their throat. The porch had settled with age, the paint chipped in spots, but it held strong, just like its occupant. The flag above swayed gently, catching the light like ripples on a lake. Walt's eyes followed its rhythm as the wind lifted and lowered the fabric, like a breathing thing. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and honeysuckle. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower droned, distant but steady. The sidewalk still glistened in patches from the morning's brief sprinkler cycle, and birds darted between fences, chasing each other like children late to school. Claire arrived just after 9, balancing a small cardboard box and humming some tune she probably picked up from the radio. "Muffins," she said simply, nudging the box onto the porch table. "Still warm." Walt grunted approvingly, already reaching for one. A few minutes later, Mrs. Santiago and Mrs. Nguyen appeared at the gate, one carrying a ceramic pot blooming with tiny marigolds, the other holding a delicate hanging ivy. "For your porch," Mrs. Nguyen said, placing the ivy gently on the railing. "Something green to keep you company." Walt didn't say much, he never did, but he tipped his mug in thanks. The two women lingered a moment, then made their way down the path, chatting quietly in the shared language of neighbors. In the mailbox sat a small envelope, the kind with a crayon mark on the flap and a few smudges along the edges. Claire retrieved it and handed it over. On the front, to Mr. Duncan, from Mrs. Santiago's granddaughter. He opened it slowly. Inside was a drawing, simple lines, bright colors. A house, a flag, and a stick figure labeled, "You," with arms outstretched beside the pole. Beneath it, in crooked but determined handwriting, "Thank you for standing tall." He held the paper a long moment. His thumb brushed the corner like he might smudge it into memory. A quiet moment passed before a young mother from down the street approached. She didn't speak. She simply placed a flower basket under his flagpole and gave a slight nod before walking away. The flowers were red and white petunias with a single blue ribbon tied around the pot. Claire picked up a small brush and a can of paint from beside the steps. "You ready?" she asked, tapping the lid. The mailbox sat nearby, cleaned off, waiting for a new coat. Together, they began applying stripes, slow, even strokes, red first, then white. Walt chuckled softly when Claire's hand slipped and left a smudge on his wrist. Later that afternoon, as the sun arced lazily above the rooftops, Claire unfolded the latest HOA newsletter and read aloud, "In celebration of community and tradition, Bridal Creek will now observe an annual Flag Week. We thank our longtime resident Walt Duncan for the inspiration." A grainy photo accompanied the text, Walt, on his porch, hand on the flagpole, faint smile on his face. Claire didn't look up. "They got your good side." Walt sipped his coffee, letting the moment settle. Toward dusk, a manila envelope arrived via the mail carrier. It bore no return address except for a stamped insignia from a regional veterans organization. Inside was a letter typed on cream paper. "Dear Mr. Duncan, we watched what you did in Bridal Creek. Your quiet insistence, your dignity, reminded us what service really means. You didn't wave a banner, you simply stood where others might have sat. For that, we thank you. And we remember. No signatures. Just that message." As the sky softened into lavender, neighborhood kids zipped past on their bicycles. Some wore helmets too big for their heads. One shouted, "Morning, sir," as he pedaled by. Walt raised his hand in a gentle salute. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. He leaned back in his chair, sipped, and murmured, "Still standing." In the stillness of a summer morning, one man's quiet dignity reminded a neighborhood what it meant to belong. Without shouting, without marching, Walt Duncan showed that standing firm can sometimes mean simply refusing to sit down. Rules are meant to guide, not to govern hearts, and when misused, they shrink the very spirit they were meant to protect. Like a single porch light glowing through the dusk, his steady grace lit the way for a community to remember itself. Perhaps it's never too late to lift our voices, gently, together, when the wind bends too hard against what's right.